right, we are in Daniel chapter 7. As we've mentioned already a couple times, the number at the top right hand of the screen, that is if you have a question, you don't feel comfortable asking it out loud, you can text it to me, and I'll try and keep an eye on it. There's no guarantee to that, but I will answer it at some point. Okay, so we're in this chapter. We've been just kind of walking through and explaining the reasoning of certain things. We have seen the image, and we talked about how it all began with this particular image, and the winds are blowing and the sea is stirring. That is, humanity is moving. And then we see this first creature come up out, the lion with eagle's wings, which we are asserting is the Babylonian Empire, okay? And I'm skipping over all the things because we spent a significant amount of time talking about it. So we're assuming that this Daniel 7 is parallel to Daniel 2 in that statue and image, that we're talking about kingdoms, okay? Then when you have the bear with 3 ribs in its mouth, that's the Medo-Persian Empire that comes up next. And then we have the leopard with 4 heads and wings of a bird, and or wings of the wings of a bird on its back. And so we're seeing these mutant beasts come up, and then we have this last guy come up. It's kind of hard to illustrate him because there's not even an animal that it can be compared to, okay, in the context. So an individual has tried to draw here, and you see the horns on its back. There are 10 in number, and that will be explained as 10 kings a little bit later when Daniel gets the interpretation of the dream. And then what happens is there's this crazy little guy right here that I mentioned last week. Have you ever seen Moana, the movie? It looks like those crazy little creatures on the ship. And if you haven't, well, just Google it. This little horn comes up. There are 3 of them that have been plucked up by the root, and this guy's come up in his place, and he is speaking loud and blasphemous things concerning God. Okay? And so that was the first 8 verses, trying to work through and see some of those things. All right, now we're going to go back to this outline, and that was things that were taking place on earth. Okay? So these kingdoms were rising up on earth, and now the scene is going to shift, and we're going to move to heaven. And we've talked about this in the introduction to apocalyptic literature, that there is constant movement like this in apocalyptic writing. It will shift quickly. For an example, when John sees the glorified Christ appear to him in Revelation 1 and addresses him in for the 7 churches in 2 and 3, he's here on earth receiving the revelation. And then in chapter 4, he sees a door standing open in heaven, and he's called to go up higher and see what is transpiring up there. And so it's not an uncommon occurrence to shift locations, and we have to pay attention to that shift. All right, so let's read verses 9 through 12. It says, "As I looked, thrones were placed, and the Ancient of Days took his seat. His clothing was white as snow, and the hair of his head like pure wool. His thrones were fiery flames, its wheels were burning fire. A stream of fire issued and came out from before him. 1,000 thousands served him. 10,000 times 10,000 stood before him. The court sat in judgment, and the books were opened. I looked then because the sound of the great words that the horn was speaking, and as I looked, the beast was killed and its body burned, and body destroyed and given over to be burned with fire. As for the rest of the beasts, their dominion was taken away, but their lives were prolonged for a season and a time." Okay, so when you're reading this, does it remind you of anything? Does it remind you of another text? Okay, well, let me just read a little bit and see if it is similar. Then I saw a great white throne, and him who seated on it. From his presence, earth and sky fled away, and no place was found for them. And I saw the dead, great and small, standing before the throne, and the books were opened. Then another book was opened, which is the book of life, and the dead were judged by what was written in those books, according to what they had done. And the sea gave up the dead who were in it. Death and Hades gave up the dead who were in them, and they were judged, each one of them according to what they had done. Then death and Hades were thrown into the lake of fire. This is the second death, the lake of fire. And if anyone's name was not found written in the book of life, he was thrown into the lake of fire. That's Revelation 20:11 through 15, which is very commonly understood to be a judgment scene, right? Okay? See, a lot of people are familiar with scenes like this. What they are unfamiliar with is that these scenes are not created out of thin air. Okay? These scenes draw back to Old Testament images. Okay? So what happens is we have this tendency to pay more attention and study almost exclusively from the New Testament. We have a tendency to do that. Okay? And because of that, we don't look at the Old Testament enough. When we read scenes like this in Daniel 7, you're like, oh, that sounds like Revelation 20. Well, they must be talking about the same thing. And the answer is no. They are not talking about the same thing. You see, what we do, and this is one of the dangers of the interpretation of apocalyptic literature that many people, in my judgment, in my estimation, they get incredibly wrong. They read Revelation 20 and they say that's the end of time, that's the last judgment of all the individuals who have ever lived. And therefore, when I read Daniel, that must be talking about the same thing. Listen, when I read books, when you read books, you don't usually start at the back and start reading to the front, right? You start at the front and you read to the back. You see, the problem is we want to, because we're familiar with the latter half of the book, we want to read the latter half of the book into the front half of the book, instead of reading the front half of the book into the second half of the book, the way it's intended to be read. Okay? And so, judgment scenes and understanding the order in which we read things and understanding where their influences are being drawn from helps us and aids us in understanding this. This that we're reading about, where the Ancient of Days is taking his seat and he's being clothed and books are being opened, it has nothing to do with the end of time judgment, of the final judgment of all mankind. It has nothing to do with that. It has to do with the judgment of the nations in this vision. Okay? So, understanding that, now because we've kind of walked through some things in the Old Testament over the last couple of years, I think we're starting to get that concept. But because a number of people, because of their lack of familiarity with the Old Testament, it's very easy to fool them into reading it backwards. Because you don't actually tell people you're reading it backwards. You just tell people that's what it means. Okay? And that's problematic. So, let's try and understand more about what is going on. So, Daniel looks and thrones were placed. Notice thrones are plural. And that will come into play when we get to 13 and 14. So thrones were placed and the Ancient of Days took his seat. Ancient of Days, the most common understanding is that it's God himself. The Ancient of Days, the fact that he's eternal. Okay? And there are tons of texts that you could look at. Psalm 90 and verse 2, before the mountains were brought forth, even from everlasting to everlasting, you are God. So from eternity to eternity. And so that's the notion. The Ancient of Days takes his seat. So you've got on the earth, all these things are transpiring. Nations are rising and falling and rising and falling, and it's chaotic. But one of the things that happens is when God peels back this curtain and he lets us see in heaven, it is anything but chaotic. It is anything but chaotic. It is in perfect order and control. And that's the point. Because when we're living down in the mess, we can feel as if the chaos is reigning. And we're sitting here going, what is God doing? Apocalyptic literature pulls back that curtain and says, God's not the least bit worried about any of this. He's not threatened by it in any way. Okay? So, his clothing is white as snow. Now, there are a couple ways to understand this, and maybe it's intended to be both. I don't know. So, white is obviously a symbol of purity. Okay? So, it could have a reference to the purity and the righteousness of God. Further, it could just be a reference to splendor. Okay? So, a glory. One of the ideas behind the word glory is brightness. Okay? Brightness. That is, at the transfiguration or at the resurrection at the tomb, you have Jesus his clothes become white and bright, that no fuller, no dry cleaners, so to speak in American context, can make it that white. Or the two angels in robes of white arrayed, as we sing, at the tomb of Jesus after his resurrection. And so it could just be a symbol of his glory, okay? But white and white clothing, especially when we get to Revelation, white clothing is indicative of righteous deeds, of a righteous life. Okay? So there's a song we sing, and I don't remember which one it is. Wait. Let me think of the word here, the wording. Okay. We're talking about washing our garments in the blood of the Lamb. Are our garments stained with sin? Okay, that's a biblical image. So when you look in Revelation and other places, it will say that their garments are pure. There's no soil, there's no stain to them. Because the garment, our clothing, is indicative of our righteous life or unrighteous life. Okay? So when we're seeing a picture of God, we're seeing a picture of righteousness to the nth degree as he is standing here in the pure white. Now, the next image is that the hair of his head is like pure wool. Okay? So what does the Bible say about gray hair and white hair? There's wisdom. This is what Solomon says in Proverbs. Okay? You use the King James, they called it the hoary head. The idea is the gray head, the white head. That there is a sense of wisdom, a person who has aged to a certain point and they have lived their lives righteously and they've aged to that point, there is a sense of wisdom that comes along with them. And so when we see the Ancient of Days coming, he's clothed in his splendor and in his righteousness, and the hair of his head is like pure wool. There is the embodiment of everything that is wisdom inside of him. Okay? Now, he's obviously being seated on the throne as a judge. And I've never appeared before, well, I don't know that I've ever appeared before a judge for an official reason anyway, but I have been in courtrooms on multiple occasions for different things. And my uncle is a retired judge, and he is a very intimidating man if you don't know him. He's huge, first of all. He's like 6'6", and he's got a voice that just booms. And one of the things about him is Uncle Charlie is a human lie detector. I mean, a human lie detector. Why? Well, before he was a judge, he was a prosecutor. He's been lied to basically his entire career. He can smell it. And there is a sense of wisdom that comes along with certain situations that he has through experience. And so when God is pictured this way, there is this sense of wisdom and purity and righteousness. We're standing before a judge who's going to do the right thing. Okay? So, and then it says his throne was fiery flames and its wheels were burning fire. It was not uncommon for thrones to be, the throne and the platform on which it's set to be, have wheels fixed to the bottom of it so it could be transported. And so this one is fire. And fire, when you look in Scripture, there are a number of different connotations with it. Fire is very often associated with the presence of God. Okay? Fire is very often associated with angels. So fire in the presence of God, you think about how did God appear to Moses? In a burning bush, fire. Our God is a consuming fire, Hebrews 12:29. The angel, Psalm 104:4, which is quoted in Hebrews 1:7-ish maybe. Hebrews 1's not very long. I know it's not in the first 4 verses, so it's somewhere between 5 and 14, and I know it's not 14 either, so it's somewhere right in there. If you read it, you're going to run into it pretty quickly. It's quoted there. He makes his ministers, his angel spirits and his ministers a flame of fire. Okay? So they have this fire. You remember in 2 Kings 2, Elijah is taken up into heaven through a whirlwind with a chariot and horses of fire. And so there's this association of fire, of purity, and fire is also a symbol of judgment. Especially in this culture, these cultures, fire was used with metals. It refines them, right? You send it through the fire, it cuts away the dross. That's what Peter means in 1 Peter chapter 1, when he says, the trial of your faith being much more precious than gold, which perishes with fire. Okay? So, here we've got the throne being set. And now, in verse 10, a stream of fire issued and came out before him. 1,000 thousands served him. This is the angelic. This is what is sometimes called the divine council. It's seen in 1 Kings 22 and some other places. So you have God and you have him surrounded by, as Revelation will call it, myriads and myriads of angels. And as a matter of fact, okay, let me try something real quick. Nope, it didn't do it. Okay. Never mind. I had something on my iPad that I was going to try and show, but I'm not going to be able to. So he's got angels, and one of the things about angels, actually, you know what? No, I'm not going to do it. In Revelation 4 and 5, when we see this image of God on his throne, it is the idea of concentric circles. Okay? So concentric circles, you have the circle in the middle, and then it just kind of radiates out. Okay? And so in these circles, I have the picture on my iPad, the lock screen is called, it was written for, I think it was drawn for Dante's Inferno. It's called Paradiso, where he draws this idea of light shining in the midst, and then myriads of angels in circles around and around and around. The idea that everything centers around God, and that all of these divine beings are there to do his will. Okay? So, that's what we're seeing in that part. Now, when it comes and says, and 10,000 times 10,000 stood before him, and the court sat in judgment, and the books were open. Okay, so 10,000 times 10,000. Now we're dealing with the people, some of the people who are going to be judged. Okay? They're standing before him. The court sat in judgment. Court was convened, and the books were opened. Okay? So, it was very common for books to be, for an example, in Esther chapter 6, the reason that Mordecai becomes appointed to his position is the king can't sleep, and so he calls for the official records to be read to him, and he learns that Mordecai has actually saved his life on one occasion. But that's the idea, that every city has always kept records. Every nation has always kept records. And the idea of the books being opened are, here are the records of these people. Here are the records of the nation. And they're going to be opened up and shown. And so judgment is transpiring, is the point. But then, in verse 11, it says this, I looked then because the sound of the great words that the horn was speaking. Okay, so the great horn, we're going back to that little horn, the three that were plucked up, and that little horn that has come up and is running its mouth. Even while heaven's throne is sitting there and judgment is being set, that little horn is running its mouth. It said, and as I looked, the beast was killed and its body destroyed and given over to be burned with fire. People say, what's significant about that? The fact that you read it quickly without significance is its significance. Let me explain that. It's meant to communicate that loud horn that persecuted God's people, how long did it take for God to deal with him? Just like that. Just like that. He's nothing. He's nothing. Even though individuals can cause incredible harm and wreak havoc on people, God has zero problems disposing of anyone and doing so very quickly. Okay? That is, no one can stand before him. Nobody is going to beat him. Nobody's even going to have a chance. Okay? He is like an overwhelming power that's going to destroy anything in his path that stands in opposition to him. And that's the message that he's communicating. And so there you have the body of that beast, the fourth beast destroyed and given over to be burned with fire, which is a common thing you do with cursed bodies. For an example, Achan and his family, their bodies were burned with fire. Joshua chapter 7, for their sins. So this beast is put away, and then it says their dominion, as for the rest of the beasts, their dominion was taken away, but their lives were prolonged for a season and a time. That is, their influence. These three previous empires, they still somewhat existed. When this fourth one is put down, it is put down in an extraordinary way that almost renders it extinct, is the idea. Okay? So there is the judgment of the creatures. All right? Any questions or anything on those? Because the vision is still continuing here in just a minute. Right, he says in 13, I saw in the night visions, and behold, with the clouds of heaven there came one like a son of man. And he came to the Ancient of Days and was presented before him. And to him was given dominion and glory and a kingdom that all peoples, nations, and languages should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion which shall not pass away, and his kingdom one that shall not be destroyed. Okay? Now, this is where we need to keep in mind, go back again to verse 9, I looked and thrones were placed. Thrones, plural. But we're only introduced to one judge, the Ancient of Days. Multiple thrones, only one person, only one being. What does that mean? That you've got at least one more throne doing what? Sitting unoccupied. Right? You've got multiple thrones. You've got the Ancient of Days on one. So there must be one throne, at least one other throne that sits unoccupied. Okay? So then he said, I saw in the night visions, and behold, with the clouds of heaven. Okay? Now, this is where our understanding of the Old Testament is going to help us understand this image. Okay? Because the clouds, let's look at two texts together for just a second, just to illustrate this. Look at Psalm 104 and verse 3. Psalm 104 and verse 3. Actually, just back up to 1 and just trying to set the context. He's praising God, and he says, Bless the Lord, O my soul. O Lord my God, you are very great. You are clothed with splendor and majesty, covering yourself with light as with a garment, stretching out the heavens like a tent. He lays the beams of his chamber on the waters. Now watch this. He makes the clouds his chariot. He rides on the wings of the wind. He makes the clouds his chariot. All right? Look at Isaiah chapter 19. Isaiah chapter 19. There are a lot of passages we could put together, but I'm just going to kind of show you a few to see how the pattern kind of develops. 19:1, it says, "An oracle concerning Egypt. Behold, the Lord is riding on a swift cloud and comes to Egypt, and the idols of Egypt will tremble at his presence, and the heart of the Egyptians will melt within them." Think about this then. Clouds in the Old Testament, the person who rides on the clouds is God. Okay? Now, to show you the significance of that before we even go back to Daniel, I want you to think about some things. Think about how, if we understand that image from the Old Testament, how it changes the way we read the New. Okay? So the clouds are the divine escort. He rides on the cloud. That's his chariot. And when he had said these things, they were, as they were looking on, he was lifted up, and a cloud took him out of their sight. And while they were gazing into heaven as he went, behold, two men stood by him in white robes and said, "Men of Galilee, why do you stand looking up into heaven? This Jesus who was taken up from you into heaven will so come in the same way as you saw him go into heaven." So why is it when Jesus ascends back into heaven, it says he went on a cloud? Because God rides on clouds. That's the point. Revelation 1 and verse 7, another apocalyptic text, "Behold, he comes with the clouds." So when Jesus said in Mark 14, when he is on trial, listen to what he says here. So in verse 60 it says, "And the high priest stood up in the midst and asked Jesus, 'Have you no answer to make? What is it that these men testify against you?' But he remained silent and made no answer. Again the high priest asked him, 'Are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed?' And Jesus said, 'I am, and you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming with the clouds of heaven.'" And by the way, in this context, I'm 99.999% certain he's not talking about his second coming either. I'm pretty sure he's talking about the coming judgment on the city of Jerusalem that transpired in AD 70. Okay, so how does that change things? Well, so people have this tendency, when they read anywhere in Scripture, when they hear Jesus saying that he's going to be on a cloud or he's being taken up in a cloud, and they read the text in Mark 14 where Jesus says you're going to see the Son of Man coming with the clouds of heaven, they automatically jump where? It's got to be talking about the second coming. It's got to be talking about the second coming. The answer is no, it doesn't. The majority of times when God is pictured as riding on the clouds, it is in judgment of a nation. Only a handful of times when God rides on a cloud, and in particular Jesus, it's talking about the judgment at the end of time. Only a handful of times. That's what he's talking about. Okay? And so then we bring that back here to Daniel 7:13, and it says, "And behold, with the clouds of heaven." You have to remember, the people who are reading this are Jewish. They would get the connotation. Someone is coming with the clouds of heaven. As a Jew who knows my Old Testament, the first thing that I'm going to think is what? The only person who rides on the clouds is God. So this person, this being, this one that's coming with the clouds of heaven, there must be something divine. And now I'm starting to understand why there's more than one throne sitting there. So I've got a being who's coming with the clouds of heaven, and there came one like a son of man, which, by the way, is Jesus' favorite designation of himself. He uses it more than 80 times in the Gospels. So the idea is a son of man is that he looks human. He looks human. Now, how did all of these other beasts, what did they look like? Yeah, they didn't even look like animals. They looked like hybrids of animals. So you have the beastly distortions of the lower order of creation, animals. And now we've got this divine being who's coming with the clouds of heaven, but he looks human. And it says, and he came to the Ancient of Days and was presented before him. And to him, this is the one with the clouds of heaven, was given dominion and glory and a kingdom that all peoples, nations, and languages should serve him. So to this one is given God's kingdom that will never end. And that's what he goes on to say. This dominion is an everlasting dominion which shall not pass away, his kingdom one that shall not be destroyed. So here's the question. Who is the only member of the Godhead who has ever come and looked like a human and was given authority over the kingdom of God? Jesus. Now, Daniel doesn't understand all that yet. We can, because we've got the whole other side of the story to help us try and understand it. But this is the idea. And so the contrast here between this vision of earth and heaven is you have the chaotic, temporary, just crazy things of the world, and then you've got the orderly, the heavenly, the kingdom that doesn't fall, the kingdom that isn't destroyed, the kingdom that rules, and it's universal in its nature, that all peoples, nations, and languages, and that is a refrain all throughout Daniel that is constant. And so we're seeing the notion of God's kingdom and this Son of Man, as Jesus will refer to himself as. This is his kingdom. Okay? Any questions or anything on that? Does that make any sense? Do I need to clarify something? I'm pretty sure I do. I'm pretty out of it. So, and if there's something we don't understand, like, if there's something that someone doesn't understand, I don't assume that's a problem with you. I assume that's a problem with me. Okay? I'm a teacher that believes that if there's a communication problem, 90% of the time it's probably on me. So I want to make sure we get it in terms that make sense. Otherwise, we're just here and I'm talking to you in some strange language. All right. Well, if you have them, you can ask anytime or send me a message anytime, and I'll try and respond to it. But that's the first vision we're given. Next week, we'll finish up it, because once we get to the interpretation side, it's really not all that complicated. And actually, the way he interprets it, the angel interprets it to Daniel, is actually pretty, it's pretty simplistic. He does not really go into tons of details about it. He just says, this is the overarching message. So go and deal with that. So we'll try and do that, and we should be able to finish that up next week.